We're going to get started with this other panel this afternoon. And first I want to thank Sean. I think he just left the room, but thanks Sean Murphy and 1455 for hosting this wonderful literary festival this summer. My name is Matthew Davis. I'm the founding director of the Cheuse International Writers Center at George Mason University. We've had the pleasure of working with Sean in 1455 on a couple of events this past winter, and we're thrilled that we will have a future partner in a lot of other events and residencies and literary festivals. So thank you all for coming this afternoon and this weekend. So the Cheuse Center that I direct, we are a cultural diplomatic center that celebrates the art of creative writing as a means of international dialogue, exchange, and understanding. And what that means is we love to look at literature and stories from different parts of the world and see how they make connections with broader humanity. So what a story from Uganda has in common with a story from Washington, D.C., or what a poem from Libya can teach us about the situation in Libya. And part of that means that we take these larger issues that we are talking about with regards to, that our focus is on literature and journalism. We really break it down in terms of story, in terms of place. And so I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel with three wonderful panelists that will talk to us a little bit about how larger issues of global affairs, larger issues of policy, how they impact personal lives. And I will introduce the panelists and we'll start the conversation, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions from all of you. So immediately to my left is Yeganeh Torbati. And she is a reporter for ProPublica based in Washington, D.C., and she previously reported for Reuters, where she covered immigration and national security issues. And prior to coming to Washington, she covered Iran for Reuters. And next to her is Pauline Kaldas. And Pauline is the author of Looking Both Ways, a collection of essays, The Time Between Places, a collection of short stories, Letters from Cairo, a travel memoir, and Egyptian Compass, a collection of poetry. So she's got poetry, novel, short story, memoir, very impressive. She also co-edited Dinarzad's Children, an anthology of contemporary Arab American fiction. She was awarded a fellowship in fiction from the Virginia Commission of the Arts and has been in residency at the McDowell Colony in the Virginia Center for the Arts. She is professor of English and creative writing at Hollins University. And finally, down there we have Mike Miller. Michael E. Miller is a local enterprise reporter for the Washington Post. Before joining the Post in 2015, Mike covered South Florida and the Caribbean for the Miami New Times. He has reported from almost a dozen countries and won several national journalism prizes, including the National Press Foundation's Fetty Reporting Award and 3 Sigma Delta Chi Awards for excellence from the Society of Professional Journalists. He often covers immigration and is fluent in Spanish. He has a joint master's degree in journalism and Latin American studies from NYU and graduated Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Chicago, where he studied philosophy. So you can see we have a wide range of international experiences and backgrounds, and all kinds of different coverage that all of you have done. So we're really very excited and grateful that they all have made the trip today. So we're going to start a little bit, we're just going to go down the line here, and I'm going to start with Yeganeh, and I'm going to ask all of them in terms of, in some form or another, whether it's journalism or creative writing, you all sort of discuss how global issues impact people's everyday lives, and how you kind of move from an abstraction of an idea or a topic into a more personal story. And I want each of you to give an example from your own work and from your own experiences about how a global issue like immigration or national identity has impacted someone's life. So maybe we'll start with you, Yeganeh. We'll just sort of work our way down.
Well, thank you so much for moderating the panel, and thank you to all of you for coming today. I'm someone who, for the last 4 or 5 years being based in Washington, D.C., I've been covering federal policy quite closely. And one thing I've realized is that, although there's a lot of there's a very lengthy regulatory process and lawmaking in Congress that happens and executive orders, those sorts of things don't often obviously translate very well to the page, and they don't really capture readers' attention. And the way that I try to make my journalism matter to a broader audience is, and I think the way that a lot of people try to do it is by making it real in terms of showing the impact on individual people. And people love stories, people love narratives, and that is sort of what really makes a story more powerful, even an investigative piece. So one example from my own work that stands out to me is I covered the travel ban quite closely, and this is something that President Trump enacted sort of at the very beginning of his term as president. And obviously you might all remember there were a lot of protests, and that was kind of like the first example we saw of sort of what kind of presidency this was going to be. Over the ensuing couple of years, that policy has gotten a lot less attention because things have died down. It sort of went transferred from something that was playing out in sorts of protests at the airport to it transferred over to the courts. It got into all sorts of legal battles, and attention really fell off. But the ban is still in place right now. The ban is enacted. It was ruled legal by the Supreme Court last year, and so it continues to affect people's lives. And I have, continued to follow it over the last couple years, and I found this story, this sort of pretty crazy scene kind of playing out. And basically what I came across was there's a library that sits directly on the US-Canada border. It's in Vermont and Quebec at the same time. And it's this library that was founded kind of before it became illegal to build a public building on an international border. But it's still in place, and it basically connects these two small towns, Derbyline, Vermont, and Stansted, Quebec. And what I discovered through some other reporting I was doing was that Iranian families who could not reunite in America had found this library and were staging reunions for a few short hours. So what would happen is there are many Iranian students who live in the United States. My parents came from Iran. They came as students. And American universities have always held a lot of prestige in Iran. And so even though we've had 30, 40 years of tensions between the two countries, Iranian students still came, thousands of them to study. And even now there's like 13,000 Iranian students studying in the United States. But they're often given only single entry visas. So if you come for a PhD, that means you spend 6 years, 7 years in America without the ability to leave America, or you risk losing your visa. Their parents, on the other hand, are often aging. They're like in their 60s and 70s. They want to see their children, but they can't enter the United States anymore because of the travel ban. And so what they've been doing is flying into Canada. The parents drive down from Montreal to this border library on the Canadian side, and the kids fly up from, I met people who had driven from New York, who had flown in from Detroit, Ohio, all over, and they meet at this library for like a few hours a day. If they're lucky, they're able to stay for a couple of nights. They'll stay on Airbnbs on either side of the border and then come and meet at this library. And it's a tiny library. The whole thing is maybe the size of this room. And you can very much see the reunions happening, like it's very obvious what's going on. And so I found out that this was happening. I tried super hard to find people to talk to me about it. Obviously, a lot of the families did not want to talk about it. They didn't want to risk their green card applications. They felt, that they might get in trouble for doing this, even though they weren't actually breaking any law. But I did find some people who were able to talk to me about it. I went there last November just kind of on a whim to decide to see if, by chance were there any reunions happening. And I witnessed 2 reunions happening. It was super cold and rainy, but people still came. And I wrote a story on it, and I featured, one woman very prominently and her family, but also talked to a bunch of other people. And we published that story. And I think it really brought home for people that this policy that you probably haven't thought about for a long time, and my own editor was like, so it's still in place? And I had to remind her that it is. It really affects people, and it affects people's families, and it shows you kind of the lengths that people will go to see their families and reunite. And so that was probably the most concrete example I've done in my work of kind of the phenomenon you're talking about.
Great, thank you. And just a quick follow-up, Yeganeh and I were talking about this earlier today, and how since her story has come out, which was also featured on This American Life, you've had many other people contact you directly, sort of, not just Iranian people, but Syrians as well, to sort of learn a little bit about the library?
Yeah, so the story came out, and I actually got a lot of criticism. I got some criticism both before it came out and then after, saying how could you write about this now the Trump administration is going to shut this down? And my answer to that is twofold. First, that I'm not actually an advocate for immigrants or an advocate for these reunions. I'm a journalist, and my role is to chronicle what's happening. It's not so much to try to prevent or enable any one activity or action from happening. Secondly, the results of any one story are really hard to predict. I mean, if I was going to think about the second and third order consequences of any one story I write, I really wouldn't write anything, because you just never know what's going to happen in reaction to your pieces. However, since the story's been published, they haven't cracked down. I just heard from a source that there were 3 reunions happening on the same day a couple days ago. Before I wrote the story, I tried really hard to find non-Iranian families who were reuniting there. Iranians are the biggest population affected by the travel ban, but also Syrians, Yemenis, Somalis. And I searched for the name of the library in Arabic to try to find social media posts about it, was anything, and I couldn't find anything. But since I wrote the piece, at least a couple Syrian families have reunited there. One got in touch with me, and having read the story got picked up by This American Life, as Matt said, for a segment. And then Samantha Bee, who has a TV show, she did a segment on the travel ban and featured the library story pretty heavily. And so it has had this sort of ongoing life, and I've heard that people kind of are using it as a guide to do their own reunions, and are sort of trying to figure, they're asking all these different individuals who I quoted in the story for advice. And so yeah, it's had very much an impact that I kind of didn't really foresee when I wrote it.
Cool, thank you. Pauline, maybe we'll go to you next, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about something from either your writing, your work, your experience that highlights this idea of these larger global issues that impact people's everyday lives.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you all for being here. I write creative nonfiction, I write fiction, I write poetry, so I think for me, it is often the personal experience that I am particularly concerned about. And sometimes the way that these global events impact us on a personal level takes me a little bit by surprise. They probably shouldn't by this point, but they still do. So what I want to do is read just a couple of paragraphs from one of my essays when something like this happened. And this took place on the day that Osama bin Laden was killed. I woke up in the morning, saw the newspaper headings, sort of saw what happened, was in some ways very disturbed by it, trying to make sense of it, talking with my family about it. So I'm just going to read you a couple of paragraphs. After dinner, I decide to walk to the grocery store to pick up a few things. It's been a warm day, and the evening breeze makes the walk pleasant. I approach the store and note a few young boys sitting on one of the tables outside. As I walk by, one of them yells out, "Osama bin Laden!" His body has turned in my direction, and his voice is aimed toward me. I'm the only one walking past them. A hard rock in the pit of my stomach, fear even here in the open sidewalk where it's still daylight. From the corner of my eye, I note how young the boy is, barely in middle school. I continue walking, my steps in the same beat, carrying the hard edge inside me. My steadiness pushed by the need to survive, to protect myself. Once inside the store, I look out to get a closer look at the boys, but they are already gone, perhaps running away from their own attempt at bravery. I linger, making my selection slowly. The truth is, I feel slightly embarrassed at the way I've been shaken by the boys' shout. I call my husband to ask whether I should buy strawberries or raspberries, even though I have already placed the raspberries in the cart. I call 2 more times, asking mundane questions. My husband's response grows irritated. I know the ring of the phone is disruptive. He might be reading, listening to music, or just following his thoughts. But right now, I'm grateful to simply be his annoying wife. The truth is, I just want to hear the voice of someone who cares about me, who does not see my ethnicity every time he looks at me, the comfort of being perceived as a person in its purest term. What did those boys see when I walked past them? Do I look like bin Laden? Maybe it's the eyebrows, those thick curved lines outlining our faces and making us look suspicious. My physical appearance is elusive. I've been identified as Italian, Spanish, African American. The combination of my darker complexion, brown eyes, black hair, and sharp angled nose lends itself to multiple interpretations, depending on the onlooker's gaze. Egyptian is not the first possibility that comes to most people's mind. But when an incident occurs that highlights Arabs in the media, people's assumptions shift and are defined in relation to the day's news. We are chameleons transformed by the political events of our time. So for me, that was one of those moments when, you wake up, you read the newspaper, and you want to put some distance between you and what is happening in the world, and then, something else happens that brings it very close to you. So I do think that there are times, particularly depending on your ethnicity, your appearance, what people are thinking about, and the way that you're perceived and the way others are taking in the news, that kind of puts you in a spotlight that's not particularly welcome.
Thank you, Pauline. That was wonderful. Thank you. And we're gonna last one to Mike. Mike, maybe you can explain a little bit of one of your stories or experiences that you've had where a global issue has impacted someone on a personal level.
Sure. Well, thank you. That was a beautiful reading, first of all, and thank you for having me here. Thank you, Matt. It's funny, actually, Yeganeh and I met at the airport right after the travel ban, and she was kind enough to translate a lot of Farsi for me, which I don't speak, so strange when you have those connections that come back to these stories. So I think this is something we're probably going to get into in a bit, but so I'm a local enterprise reporter. That enterprise just means that I do kind of longer stories that are kind of narratively told as much as possible, as Yeganeh mentioned. I'm mostly based here in DC. I do Virginia, Maryland, DC. But over the past year and a half, I've done a lot of immigration reporting. As Matt mentioned, I speak Spanish, and so that's taken me to a lot of different places around the country, to the border several times, and to Mexico. And so I think we're going to talk about this in a bit, but the challenge for me, and I think everybody on the stage now, is how to tell stories that kind of puncture through this moment that we're in here in America, where it seems like people are very kind of calcified into different camps. There's obviously a lot of tension, a lot of anger, a lot of division, and I think we're in this strange media moment where there's one figure, one politician who kind of sucks the oxygen out of the room, I guess you could say. And then we live in this 24/7 kind of media landscape where, CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, it's a lot of other kind of celebrity type people talking about the one person sucking the oxygen out of the room and how to respond to that. So I think the challenge for me is how to break through that and how to tell stories that really resonate with people, whether they are on the right, the left, they're in mid-America, or here on the East Coast, West Coast, or overseas, right? And so I just want to briefly kind of talk about two stories that I've worked on. The first one is the Migrant Caravan. So that's obviously became a big issue in October of last year. The president was tweeting about it, about the thousands of people that were marching, quote unquote, towards the border. And I'm sure people in this room have different feelings about that, and I understand that. My kind of goal, what I wanted to do in covering the Migrant Caravan, was to actually find out who was in it and tell some of their stories. So again, as Yeganeh said, I'm not an advocate for immigrants. I'm a journalist, and so I think it's really important to give our subjects their full humanity, which means tell their stories in all the detail, whether it is good, it's bad, it's complicated, it's gray. People have messy stories. Their asylum stories are not always straightforward. Their reasons for coming to this country are not always black or white. And so I flew to southern Mexico and met up with this caravan of migrants, mostly from Honduras, but also from other countries. It was about 10,000 people at that point, and as you can imagine, they're going through southern Mexico, through small towns, staying the night kind of in the plaza, in tents that they're kind of making from blankets and tarps that they have carried with them. And so the president had been talking about how the Migrant Caravan was overwhelmingly men, and saying that they included terrorists or members of MS-13. And I've covered MS-13 quite a lot. That's a real issue, but I wanted to see, was that true? Who was in the caravan? And what I found was that a lot of families, a lot of women with small children, some teenagers who didn't have anybody else with them. And so I think one of the questions that Matt was asking us before we came to think about was, how do we decide who to write about? And so I wanted to write about some of these kids, and what would bring a kid from Honduras to be in a caravan by themselves, now hundreds, almost 1,000 miles away from where they came from, on the way to another country. And I found, after spending a couple of days there talking to people, I found 2 kids who I thought really had a powerful story that I could tell in a unique way that might kind of puncture those divisions and get people from all spectrums to read about it. And basically one kid was 12, one kid was 16, Javier and Isaac. They came from the same town, the same neighborhood in Honduras, and they were friends there. And within, I think, a day, maybe hours of one another, one had decided to leave because he was, I think, the youngest of 8 or 9 kids. He had no real opportunities there, and he borrowed, I think, $8 from his boss. He was working at 12, because that's the reality in Honduras. He borrowed $8 and was able to catch a bus and meet up with the caravan as it kind of left Honduras and made its way through Guatemala into Mexico. And hours later, his friend Javier, who's a little bit older, 16, decided to follow him. And so when I was talking to them, I found that they were at these very different moments in their journey. And so Isaac, even though he was younger, 12 again, he was adamant about going to the United States. He felt he had nothing behind that he wanted to go back to. He lived in a tent, basically, in Honduras, like a house that had no real walls, had tarps for the wall. And so like the tent that he was staying in this plaza in Mexico was about the same that he was living in. But Javier, he had snuck out, like Isaac did, kind of in the middle of the night, without telling his parents that he was leaving. And when he had called home to tell his mom, this is where I am, his mom had said, basically, she had had some type of like heart attack or heart, issue. She became very ill because she was so worried about her youngest child. And so he was in this moment where he was trying to figure out what he was going to do. Was he going to stay with the caravan, make his way to America? Was he going to turn back and go back to his mom? And so I tried to tell that in a narrative way that would kind of put people in his shoes and make them think about, what would they do in that moment? Could they sympathize or understand somebody going through that wrenching decision and having his whole life kind of pivot on that moment? The other story I just want to briefly mention was family separation. I covered that quite a lot last year. That was about a year ago now when it really came to a head. And I started out by going to the border and going to the courthouses where these parents who had been charged with a crime for entering the country illegally, which wasn't going on generally previously. They weren't normally charged with a crime when they were seeking asylum and coming to the country, but under this administration they were, as of kind of last spring. And I went to the courthouse, and you could see the parents sitting in the benches, and they hadn't seen their kids in a couple days. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. They were distraught. Many of them were covered in the dirt that they had, they had gotten on themselves from coming into the country, from wading through the river, whatever it might have been. And so I remember writing about that scene in the courthouse, and then my editor said, well, what about the kids? Where are the kids? What's going on with them? What are they going through in this moment? And so, to make a long story short, I set out to try to find some of those kids to write about, the kids who had been separated from their families. And through a number of interviews, several weeks later, I came to learn about this boy, 5 years old, from Guatemala, who'd been separated from his father, and he'd been sent to a shelter in Chicago. And according to other kids I spoke to, he was injected many times with things. Whenever he would get out of control, he would get angry, he would be injected, and they would put him to sleep, just at his desk in the classroom. So this is what the other kids told me, and I was able to find this kid and talk to him eventually when he'd been reunited with his father in Georgia, and they were living in rural Georgia in a kind of a shotgun house with some relatives. And in one sense, it was kind of a happy story because they'd been reunited after several months apart at that point. But on the other hand, the boy was severely traumatized. He was angry, he was hitting things, he talked about killing things. When he would play with, dolls and things, he would talk about things dying, them being ejected and dying. And I remember he was sitting on a little porch in his little car, and I was just sitting there listening to him, and he wasn't saying anything for a little bit, sitting in the car trying to make it go, and he was trying to make it go off the edge of the porch. And without any prompting, he just said in Spanish, "I want to die." And so I tried to capture that, what that kid was going through, what his family was going through, again, in order to not advocate for anything, but just show people around the country what the individuals at the heart of these big macroeconomic stories that we hear about.
Thank you, Mike. That's very moving. And I think all three of the stories that you shared really highlight just how important narrowing down and personalizing these larger issues that you all read about and cover. And off of that, and what Mike was saying a little bit earlier, Pauline, maybe you can start this conversation a little bit about I don't want to get in the weeds too much, but about process, about how you decide to tell the stories that you tell. I mean, do you look at things initially from an issue and then board down into a personal story, or do you find a story and then broaden out into an issue? And Pauline, since you work in many different forms, I thought it might be interesting to start with you, then maybe Mike and Yeganeh can sort of add on to that. But especially with regards to how you choose to write fiction or nonfiction or poetry, what sorts of things are motivating you creatively?
Thanks, Matt. That's actually a pretty tough question. And you sent it to us, and I've been thinking about it, and I want to say I start with the personal. I'm interested in people, but that's not entirely true. I'm also interested in these events. And so I think my best attempt at an answer is to say that they are very circular. They are almost simultaneous in the way that they happen. One of my very earliest memories was when I was 6 years old and the '67 war happened and I was in Egypt. And I remember we had to turn off the lights at night. We could only have a small candle because at that point when the Israeli planes were flying overhead, they were looking for the city lights. So everybody in the city had to turn off the lights so that they wouldn't drop bombs on us. I did not understand all of that, obviously, when I was 6, although I came to understand how crucial that whole experience really was. What I did experience was a sense of fear and a sense of uncertainty and a sense of really something was happening that would in some way or another endanger my family. And so I think that being my first experience, for me, these global events and the personal experiences are always sort of happening almost, they're simultaneous. They're at the same time. And so I think what I'm most interested in are people within those experiences. What is happening to people inside of a war situation or a major global issue? And again, just because I'm a little bit more comfortable perhaps sharing with you something that might exemplify that, I wrote a good bit about the Arab Spring when it was happening. I still have family in Egypt. At the time, my aunt was in her 80s. She had lived through King Farouk, King Fuad, Nasser, the revolution, Sadat, Mubarak. She had seen all of it, and so she was a wonderful resource for me. And so during the Arab Spring, I was continuously talking with my family, and I was also listening to the news at the same time. So just a short paragraph that that might, I think, sort of indirectly kind of get at an answer to this. The news tells us that there are 2 million people in Tahrir Square. The cameras from CNN, Al Jazeera, and BBC are focused on them, their perspective looking down. I imagine these cameramen on the balcony or rooftop of one of the buildings surrounding the square, having secured themselves a safe spot with a good view to bring us this image of the crowd surging in Tahrir. But as I watch the images, my eyes lose their focus, and I leave this crowd to walk down the streets that pull away from the square and move toward the neighborhoods I know. If there are 2 million people protesting in Tahrir, then there are 16 million people sitting in their homes in Cairo. This is where the news cameras cannot enter. This is the experience of the protests for most Egyptians. They are held captive in their homes, watching the news, and each day, family members call each other to make sure others are okay and to exchange news that exists neither on our Western TV nor on the Egyptian state channel. In the morning, someone in each household is sent out to see if any stores are open, to buy what food is available, and to stand in the long lines in hopes of buying some bread. They make do with what they have. They are eager for this uprising to end so they can return to their jobs and their children can go back to school. Their anxiety comes from not knowing what will happen next and how all of this will get resolved. So I think for me, that large event of the Arab Spring was very real, was very vital, and I did write about the protest and what was happening and the politics behind it. But I was also very interested in the individual lives and those people who were not out there protesting, but were inside their homes, sort of trying to survive that event. So I think for me, the larger event and the people are always sort of happening, like it's simultaneous.
Yeah.
I guess that's how I would describe it.
Yeah, that was beautifully written. That was very interesting too, that dynamic of the people in the street and the people at the home and how they're both sort of intertwined that way. Mike, let's go to you for a little bit. So you talked a little bit about your experiences in reporting on the Caravan. I'm wondering, so it sounds like in some instances you go down to cover a story, a topic, an issue. Have you ever, in your experiences as an enterprise reporter, started with a person and gone outwards in terms of, here's someone's story who I want to tell, or is it usually idea, issue, and then finding the right person to reflect that?
Sometimes it does kind of work that way. I guess before I answer, I just want to say I really want to read your book. I don't know if it's on sale out there, but it sounds great. Sometimes stories kind of come to you, and sometimes you learn of an interesting person, and you realize that maybe they just have a fascinating story, or maybe they stand for something larger that you really want to write about. And other times you kind of have to you have to find that person. I'm trying to think. Sometimes we have projects that we work on where we want to examine an issue. Right now we're kind of in the middle of a hate crimes project, writing about hate crimes not only in the DC area but around the country. And so, my editor would probably kill me if I gave too much away. But, this is one where we have this idea. We want to explore what hate crimes are like, what they mean, the impact that they have, who commits them, who are the victims. And we want to find people. We want to find characters, I shouldn't say characters, people, real people who can carry those stories, right? And who are, you can write about and then get at these bigger issues. And again, you need a person at the center of these stories, even if it's about a big issue, because, I think if you are writing about just hate crimes, or how they're going up in the country, or, if there's no person at the center of the story, then people's eyes are gonna glaze over. And I think probably most of you in the audience would agree, right? Like, you might give that a couple paragraphs, right, on your phone. You might scroll down once or twice, but unless there's a person at the heart of it who you can, maybe not consciously, but at least some level subconsciously identify with, who intrigues you, you want to know more about what happens to that person, you're going to quickly tune out. And so certainly somebody who writes longer stories, I want to pull people through that. I want them to read it. I want them to see everything that I've seen and talk, in a sense, talk to the people I've talked to. And so you really need to figure out an engaging way to do that, and to tell that through a person or several people is really the way to do that. Sometimes those stories do come to you. I remember I had a young woman once who came to me and said that she had this incredibly tragic story where her father had some type of mental break and had killed her mother, and then driven across town and basically went to his son's college dorm room, and then asked him to come down to the car, and then killed his son, and then killed himself. So this young woman was suddenly the only survivor of her family. 3 of her relatives, the rest of her family basically was gone, just in the blink of an eye. And so that story basically came to me. She and her relative, another relative, came to me and wanted me to tell that story, and it was a question of, how do I tell this best? What does this story mean to her, but also to other families who have gone through something similar? She was struggling to make sense of this. She was struggling with, other relatives in her family thought that perhaps there was something else going on. Perhaps the father didn't do it. There was some kind of conspiracy theories. And she was just at the center of it all, kind of trying to figure out, what do I believe? What happened? How do I deal with this? How do I mourn my family when my father apparently did something like this? So that's a story that you just try to do justice to, because you already have the person, you already have the story, you already have the plot. And other times you kind of go in search of a person, as I said, to kind of exemplify a bigger issue.
Great. Thanks, Mike. What about you, Yeganeh? What sort of has your process been with that?
Sure. So my previous job at Reuters, which I left in May, and then I've just now started at ProPublica for about a month. But in both jobs, my role is very sort of policy focused. So I very much always start out with like, oh, here I'm covering immigration, or I'm covering the ban, or now I'm sort of like my beat is the federal government. So there's a lot of different things, but it very much starts with like, there are people either in Congress or the White House or wherever making decisions, and those policies are going to impact people all across the country and across the world. And so I kind of start out with the general idea and the data and the trend, and then try to find people who are impacted in one way or another. So kind of the first way that Mike was talking about, where you kind of start out with an idea or a policy that you're looking at, and then try to personalize it through someone. I would agree with everything he said, that if you don't kind of have characters or people at the heart of it, it can be it just won't engage people as much.
So we were talking about this a little bit earlier in the panel. Mike, I think you brought this up in terms of how you puncture this media landscape. And I know just from being here earlier today, that was a point of conversation as well, with not simply the segregation of views that people have in terms of what they attune to, but also how it's done on whether you're watching Fox News or CNN or MSNBC. I mean, there seems to be a format, right, that all these networks have. And so for those of the 3 of you write story-based journalism or fiction, with people at the center of your work, how does that find a home in today's media landscape? And I think, one of the I think there is sort of a desire, a thirst for longer form journalism and fiction, because of just, we see so much of it not around in the contemporary media landscape. But how do these stories get told when there's Twitter, there's Facebook, there's the news coverage on television at the very least, and on the web tends to be so shallow. Mike, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, that's a heavy question. The short answer is I don't know, and it's an evolving challenge, and I think we as storytellers have to be better and have to be kind of evolving as well in how we tell these stories. I know that, at the Washington Post, I have a desk, I have, a cubicle, and it's an open floor plan or whatever you call it. So, I can see into the distance, and we have TVs like everywhere. CNN is on like in the background, and I should point out that we have other TVs tuned to other stations. But I am somebody who, it is my job to write like longer stories about stuff and people and kind of, that is my job, and that's what I'm devoted to. And it's like the TV is right next to my computer, and so I just can't help but like get my head gets pulled in that direction all the time. And I think it's a serious challenge, and now in the age of Twitter, it's probably worse than ever. I mean, I check Twitter all the time. I'm probably addicted to it, on some level. And how do we get past that, or how do we get through that? I don't know. I think we have to be, more inventive about how we tell stories. At the Washington Post, we are trying to do a lot more kind of interesting multimedia, interactive storytelling. And also we have, we're reaching out to younger viewers via Snapchat and things like that, where they're totally different formats of telling stories. But I think, it is a serious challenge, and we have analytics where we can tell exactly at what point people stop reading our stories, and it's a little depressing because you can tell when people tune out after 3 or 4 graphs, and so how we get past that, I'd like to say that part of it is just, if you tell a story really well, you can pull viewers in still. You can cut through all that noise and get people to read. And then also, I guess it cuts the other way too. Social media, stories go viral, and then you have readers all around the world. So that's kind of a positive aspect of our kind of strange moment we live in right now.
Sure. Yeah, I find it very difficult. I mean, if I weren't sort of in the news business, I think I would just not want to watch any or even read any, because it just seems like you're being bombarded all the time. I was just on vacation for a couple weeks and deleted Twitter off my phone, and I was actually very pleasantly surprised. Like, I still knew the basics of what was happening, but I didn't feel this like constant sense of panic that I do when I'm reading Twitter. And I'm increasingly sort of feel distracted when I look at it, or even just, there's just so many inputs coming in that, I sort of wish we could just sort of tune out a little bit and still watch the news and still kind of have a basic sense of what's going on, but not kind of be bombarded by a million things every day. I don't really feel like it's all that healthy. This isn't really answering your question, but I think at ProPublica, at least, we have a much more sort of conversational tone with people, with our work. I think a lot of outlets are also trying to do, like you were mentioning, sort of like all different kinds of media, so both print but also video, and trying to do collaborations with radio. I think broadcast is much more powerful than print in sort of capturing people. So when you're listening to a radio story or watching a documentary or a TV clip, even just seeing the images and hearing the sounds, I think sucks you in much more than reading even the most beautifully written print piece. So trying to like translate our reporting into different media, I think really helps. But no, it's a huge challenge, and it's sort of hard to know, like, your average person, like going to work, having to like worry about a million things. What do they actually take away from the work that you're doing? It's really hard to know.
And what about you, Pauline? As someone that does a little bit longer form fiction, and you do short stories and nonfiction as well?
I love a good story, and I do think the power of journalism that comes with these longer stories with people at the center of it, I think that highlights what matters in the most powerful way of all. So I still believe in that, and at the same time, some of the social media things, which I did not grow up with, but I appreciate perhaps hearing about stories that might not be so visible in my world. And sometimes that can be the advantage of looking at, at Facebook and those things like that, what stories matter to people that you know, and therefore getting perhaps a larger sense of what's going on, particularly in the international sense. So I know for me, I depend a little bit more on social media to get a sense of what's happening in the rest of the world. But I still very much believe in the power of a good book. And just to pick up actually a little bit on the previous panel, my work has been published by university presses and by small publishers. Looking Both Ways was published by Cume Press, which has a focus on the Middle East. And so in particular to have these presses that focus on a particular part of the world. University of Arkansas also does a lot of work on the Middle East, so does Syracuse University Press. I think these publishers have done a great deal to bring us some really good books, and there's nothing like sitting down with a good novel, a good memoir, and sitting with it for a long period of time, becoming engaged with it, or even finding yourself reading and then wanting to look something up, wanting to learn something more because of whatever the story has brought up for you. So I guess that's where I am with it.
So we're about that time when some questions could be asked. If folks have questions they want to ask about this topic or the reporting, yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for being here. You are the people that I look for to get through that confusion. I trust you guys, and I really, really appreciate the truth you bring us in your stories. But you have bosses, and you have very powerful, wealthy. Bottom line is the only thing they see hanging above your head. Do you push it every chance you get, or do you say, so be it, and get as much out there as you can? What happens?
Reuters, which I worked for previously, is part of a for-profit company. I now work for ProPublica, which is a nonprofit outlet, and so I'm very fortunate in the sense that their major focus is on getting the news out widely to as many people as possible, and so we pair up with a lot of different publications, local publications when the story we're working on affects one community, or big national or international publications as well, and they allow different outlets to print their work for free. But even when I was at Reuters, I mean, I felt very lucky in that I never had any pressure from editors to write certain stories because they would get a lot of hits. They gave me 2,000 words for that library story. I was a little bit surprised at how much length I got there, but it was a very popular story and it did very well, and you just sort of never know what's going to resonate. But I also did lengthy stories on like pretty hefty policy issues that didn't have major characters in them, but were just about like big regulatory or legal changes that were happening. And so I never felt a sense of sort of bottom line pressure, but again, Reuters is part of a large kind of corporation, Thomson Reuters, and so we were pretty insulated from financial pressures. I felt very lucky about that, but I don't know if you had a different experience at the Post or.
It's a great question. And obviously working for the Post, the owner of the Post is Jeff Bezos, one of the richest people. I guess he is probably the richest on the planet, right? So I guess you could look at that several ways, right? Him buying the Post has given us a little bit more of maybe security, right, than we had previously. But at the same time, he's obviously somebody who knows how to make money, and we are a for-profit newspaper. I think just in the last maybe 2 years, we are now in the black after losing money for several years. So that I think is a good sign. I mean, I don't think we're making tremendous amounts of money, but it's because I think we are in this moment where people see the value of the Washington Post, of news. Subscriptions are up after declining for a while. And I think things like ProPublica is an amazing organization and a different model, but one that's really terrific. To answer your question, I joined the Post working overnight, and it was a job that was, I was writing another article, a different article every night, and it was very much to bring people to the paper, right? So I was writing about news, I was writing about, things that would grip people, were very interesting, but they were short stories I do every night. And that was to bring people to the paper in the hopes that they would subscribe. So that, that was, I got that job because Bezos, I think, because he had bought it, and this was like an initiative under him. Now I have a very different job where I can spend, this hate crime story I'm working on now, I've spent months on it, and it hasn't come out yet. So I think, realistically, it has to be a blend of the two. I mean, there are different models. ProPublica has a different model, of course, but for us, we still need to make money in order to pay journalists like me. We need, people to subscribe, and I think, the basic belief is that if we do a good job, we tell stories that are important and moving, that move people like you and make you want to subscribe, that we'll do okay on the business side. And we really have to marry those two. But I never have felt any pressure to write a story a certain way or to not write a story. Of course, we have people at the Post who write about Amazon, who write about Bezos, and they don't have any restrictions. They write critically of him when there's a critical story to write. So, it's tricky, and it's not an easy moment for media, but it's looking a little rosier than it was a couple years ago. How much of that depends on the president and what he says and how he's made people want to read the Washington Post, Amazon Washington Post. I guess we'll see. We'll see what happens in a couple years and how we're doing then. But yeah, I hope I answered your question.
My experience is a little different, but I've had wonderfully supportive publishers and supportive editors for my work, and I've never been asked to change content. And I think that's one of the advantages of working with smaller publishers and university presses, is that they are open and receptive to the kind of work that writers want to do and to saying what it is that we want to say.
Great. Any other questions? So maybe, if there's no more questions, if we ask one last question, I think one of the things, all of us, or many of us, have either lived overseas or spent time overseas. And I think as Americans, it's hard, I'm always struck by how I consume story and media when I'm overseas as opposed to when I'm in the United States. And I wonder, especially in terms of global affairs and how that impacts not just the United States, but the broader world. Maybe because you've all written about or covered issues that are America-based, but really global in terms of their impact. So what do you see as, how do you, as writers, as journalists, how do you balance that between knowing what you're doing is in some ways both an American but also a global story, and how does that impact what you're writing about? Does that question make sense? A little bit?
It makes sense. I don't know that I have like a particularly sharp answer for it. Obviously, immigration is a huge issue in America, but it's also a huge issue in every country right now, in a lot of countries. Venezuela right now has a huge refugee crisis. There are sort of far-right governments coming to power in Europe. It's been an issue in Australia for a long time. So what I've sort of realized over time is that a lot of these things are just, the things that we experience as kind of like very unique to America right now are actually kind of playing themselves out in a lot of different places. I spent a couple months in Guatemala last year learning Spanish, and one thing that struck me was that sort of there's like a white supremacy in Guatemala as well, in the sense that there's like a long-standing history of light-skinned Guatemalans being treated differently than darker-skinned Guatemalans, who tend to be sort of the more indigenous population. And that just struck me as like, oh, we deal with the issue of racism in America, and in Central America, that's also the case. Whereas maybe if you met a light-skinned Guatemalan here, you just wouldn't even realize that they come from like a whole history of that same sort of, it's just really very much like reverberates. Guatemalans sometimes I've heard some discriminatory things about Salvadorans from Guatemalans. Like they sort of see themselves, some of them see themselves as above, certain other countries that are right next to each other. So that experience kind of struck me as like, oh, a lot of the things that we see here is like we criticize America for, and we experience it on a daily basis, reverberate in a lot of different places. And my family's from the Middle East. There's certainly a lot of sort of there's discrimination as well in the Middle East, and I think it's just important to recognize that we within all these other countries we're also seeing some of the same issues, and maybe we can learn from each other and how to deal with them a little bit better as well.
I lived in Egypt for a number of years in the 90s, and also for a short period of time around 2002, and watching the news in Egypt was incredibly enlightening for me. A great deal more time is spent on international news than there is on the TV channels, on our news shows here, and it's a much wider, broader perspective. I mean, real time is given to what is happening in other places in the world, and it made me realize how little of that we actually get in the United States news, at least on television. There was also a great deal more coverage of Palestine and Israel. The scenes that were given were more graphic, more detailed than anything that we were getting here. And I think that was a moment for me when I realized to what extent the news really impacts us in terms of having an understanding of where we are in the world, what is happening, and really where we fit in. So I know for me, I think a great deal about audience for my work, and I try very hard not to just default to thinking of my audience as simply an audience in the United States, but to think of my audience in a more global sense, and to think of my work and the audience that I am reaching as being much larger than that.
So, I mean, working for the Washington Post, obviously we are based in DC. This is the center of power in the United States, arguably the world, right? And so, there is a sense in which you want to write about that, about how America influences other countries and those connections, diplomatic, financial, militaristic, whatever it might be. I think the stories that I mentioned earlier, family separation, the Migrant Caravan, the connections, the importance of it to different countries is pretty clear, right? But I was in Afghanistan for about a month, back in 2016, I think it was, and I was just kind of giving a break to the people who were the actual correspondents there. And the challenge for me was, you could easily write about the American presence there, the war that is still going on there. But how do you also try to cut through that or tell a different story in a way, get people to read about it after 15 years, right? And so I think part of that is just trying to be creative, and this is where you kind of bring maybe some nonfiction, some fiction and creative nonfiction writing skills to the news. And so one of the stories I chose to write about was how there is what I called, I think, car bomb graveyard in Kabul. So the war has been going on for so long, and not even just the war, but the conflict previously has been going on for so long there, that there is a giant lot full of mangled cars from all the car bombs over the years. So just as far as the eye can see, just one car after another that are destroyed and reduced to pieces, right? And each one of those, I mean, usually people were in them, people were next to them, so a lot of them are covered in blood, maybe they're years old, you can see bits of clothing attached to them, or relics of people's lives. And so that was a story that I'd never seen told, but it was a way to write about, this country in a way that Americans, because, the readers for the Washington Post are mostly Americans, that they would see that in a new way and hopefully be moved by it and be reminded of the war and its cost and of their own connection, their government's connection to that. So you know, again, I think you ask really brilliant, difficult questions, and there's no easy answer, but I think all three of us on stage are struggling with that in our work.
Yeah, awesome. Great, well, thank you so much. Real quickly, if you want to learn more about the center that I direct, you can ask me afterwards. We're also at cheusecenter.gmu.edu. You can follow Yeganeh and Mike on Twitter. Do you want Twitter, Pauline?
No.
No. Or you can definitely follow them on Twitter.
I just have a website.
He just has a website. What is your website?
PaulineKaldas.com.
PaulineKaldas.com. Thank you so much to Sean for 45. Thank you all for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day.